So we pick up here with part two of this week's online lecture, and we're going to cover Amy Tan's Two Kinds, which is probably a little bit easier to understand than Kingston's piece, but a little bit lengthier as well. And I think it's fair to say that if we take a look at this, it deals with, of course, an intergenerational culture clash, and kind of the darker side of the American dream, projecting our hopes on our children. Again, I come back to this. I mean, many of you may be from immigrant families. You or your parents or your grandparents anyway, were from another country and moved to the United States. And, people love to talk about the very successful stories of immigrants, which we should celebrate because it's a really cool thing. It's a great thing about the country, is that people can come from all over the world to pursue their dreams, and be very successful. But there's a kind of a downside to that, and I think Tan's piece here, which comes from the larger novel called The Joy Luck Club, which came out in the 80s, which was a very good novel, made a movie out of it as well, that there's a lot of pressure on immigrant kids, a whole lot. And of course, with this particular short story, you get to see that played out. This is very autobiographical in that the child here was pushed to be some sort of prodigy, and this is because the mother really foisted this on her, because the mother wanted so desperately for these great things to happen to her child. And you have to ask, well, does she want it for her child or does she want it for herself? And the answer is probably both. But she had these huge expectations, right? She wanted her child to be a genius. She wanted her child to know the capital of Finland. She wanted her child to be able to read and memorize almost everything on a page in the Bible. Just all these kinds of, she's searching for a way to find some great talent within her child. And she settles, of course, upon piano. They're watching a television show that was popular when I was a very small child, the Ed Sullivan Show, variety show, and they bring on all kinds of acts. They bring on comedians and singers and dancers and acrobats and things, and they bring on this child piano prodigy, and she's just unbelievably good, right? And so all of a sudden, the mother in this short story says, "Well, that's it. That's what you're going to be, and we're going to put you to work." Now, unfortunately, they hire a fellow to do the lessons who's not able to hear. He's kind of over the hill a bit, and disaster ensues, of course. And it's one of those things that's funny, but it's painfully funny, if funny at all. But it's a disaster. And it's a seminal moment in the child's life, in the narrator's life, because it marks this point where she says, "I'm no longer going to do what my mother says," right? And hence the title of the piece, Two Kinds, because her mother says there are two kinds of children: those who obey their parents and those who just do their own thing, and these are bad kids. Well, guess what kind of kid she's going to be? She's going to be the one that does what she wants to do. And of course, Tan was that way. Tan basically decided to kind of go her own way and pursue her own lifestyle and her own career, quite apart from what her parents wanted. And that break between what your parents expect of you and your obligation to them versus the desire to go on and live your own life is huge. But it's particularly huge with immigrant families, right? Again, I'm going to say this, and you guys who are from immigrant families are going to go, you are always reminded, if not by them, in your own mind, of the sacrifices that they made to get where they are, right? To get ahead, to get out of one bad situation and get into a situation where they have opportunity for a change and their children will have a better life. Think about, some people have done some unbelievably heroic things with their lives to get to this country, to build a life for themselves. That story of coming to this country with nothing in your pockets and swimming here from someplace. Taking a boat ride that was terribly dangerous and crossing over through a desert or whatever. It's inspiring, but it's also huge amounts of pressure because you see yourself as, I never had to do what my parents had to do or my grandparents had to do. I had it easy. Everything was done for me. And that is a tremendous burden and obligation on that child to say, you can do anything you want. And that's what the mother in the short story says. You can do anything you want. And the child says, no, I can't do anything I want. No one can do anything they want. No one can. I just want to do what I want to do with my life, what I was born to do. And I don't know what that is yet, but it's not playing the piano with a deaf piano teacher and banging out clunky notes all the time, right? So there is this, and of course, because the mother has projected all this on her, on the child, all of her hopes, all of her dreams, all of her aspirations had to be put on hold. Because, and again, this is a family that's from China. You have to understand a little bit about 20th century Chinese history. And that is, the Chinese suffered enormously in World War II at the hands of the Imperial Japanese. The massacres and the oppression and the hardship. And then after that, the communist revolution, there was just mass starvation. There was just all kinds of things that people had to put up with. And the issue for her is, having to overcome that and to build a better life for your child, you pretty much had to put your dreams on hold. Well, is it normal for people to put their dreams on hold and only do something for their children's dreams? Or do you end up doing what this mother does and you kind of use your child to fulfill the dreams you didn't get to fulfill? You hate to blame the lady because she's been through a lot, but at the same time, you can't help saying, yeah, but you can't do that to a kid because she can't possibly live up to what you want. It's a very real struggle. It's a very, very common struggle. And what's sad about it is that there is this pervasive sense of failure and disappointment and the legacy of that failure and disappointment. You grow up, and if you didn't do what your parents wanted you to do, you always feel this sense of, they made these sacrifices and I disappointed them, and I didn't, was their sacrifice in vain? I don't want to be the kid who inherited opportunity and wasted it. You see, that's a big thing. And so ultimately, whereas we're used to hearing immigrant stories of great success, this is an immigrant story of not failure, but failure of a kind, because ultimately it is a story about loss and gain, right? The loss and sacrifice of one generation, and sometimes the unwanted and unappreciated gain of the next. She goes on to be a very successful person, just not what her mother wanted her to be. And she's invested all of this into it. And we see this throughout the story. I'll pick out a couple of great passages here. It says, after seeing my mother's disappointed face once again, something inside of me began to die. I hated the tests and the raised hopes and failed expectations. Oh gosh, folks, if you have kids, whatever you do, if they don't live up to your expectations on something, never tell them that you're disappointed in them because of that if they tried hard. The kid can see it, man. They can see it and they can feel it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, mom's disappointed. And it's really crushing for someone to feel that way. She tries her best as a child to act like a so-called, quote, proudly modest little proper Chinese child. But it's really hard to do, right? Because again, just like with Kingston, you've got a person here who's got a foot in both cultures. And that puts you in a very unique and peculiar situation. Not unique and peculiar in the American experience, quite common in the American experience throughout our history, but unique in terms of some of the peers around you. And, I can only imagine that if you grow up in that way, you say, you know what, many of my friends who are not from immigrant families, they don't get it. They don't understand what I deal with and what I go through. I only say this not because, like I said, not because I've lived it, but because I had so many students who have lived it and have expressed that to me. And I think I can have some empathy towards that because I understand what they're telling me. My mother's expression was what devastated me. A quiet, blank look that said that she had lost everything. I felt the same way, and it seemed as if everybody were now coming up like gawkers at the scene of an accident to see what parts were painfully missing. That's when I remembered that she had lost in China. So they get in this big row after the failed piano concert, and they get in a big row, a big argument. Oh, and have you ever said something that was so awful that you can't believe, even before it's out of your mouth, you can't believe you actually said it or were in the process of saying it, and then afterwards, once you've said it, you can't unsay it? Her mother had lost children, right, during that time in China. Starvation, civil war, death, carnage. I mean, it was an awful time between 1920 and 1949 or 50, and even thereafter. The Chinese went through some just awful things as a country and as a people. And she lost 2 children, and they died or were miscarried. Let's see. She says, that's when I remembered the babies she had lost in China, the ones we never talked about. Now, they may have died or they may have been stillborn or whatever. They never talked about them, right? We don't talk about the bad things in the Past. We're in a new country now. We're leaving all that behind us. I don't want to talk about that. And she says, then I wish I'd never been born, I shouted. I wish I were dead like them. Ooh. Now, when you say something bad to somebody and they shout back at you, that can be pretty rough. But when you say something bad to somebody and it just crushes them, that's probably the worst outcome you can imagine, when they don't shout back. It was as if I had said magic words. Alakazam. And her face went blank, her mouth closed, her arms went slack, and she backed out of the room, stunned as if she were blowing away like a small brown leaf, thin, brittle, lifeless. It's the one thing that you should never have said to her. And, she's a child, and children say things they shouldn't say, and that's how we all learn. But she never forgot that she said something that was so mean, so hurtful, that was just such an irreparable wound. It was not the only disappointment my mother felt in me. In the years that follow, I failed her so many times, each time asserting my own will, my right to fall short of expectations. I didn't get straight A's. I didn't become class president. I didn't get into Stanford. I dropped out of college. For unlike my mother, I did not believe I could be anything I wanted to be. I could only be me. And that's reasonable, right? That's not unreasonable. No one's going to be able to do all of those things. It's just unrealistic. And for all those years, we never talked about the disaster at the recital or my terrible accusations afterward at the piano bench. All that remained unchecked, like a betrayal that was now unspeakable. So I never found a way to ask her why she had hoped for something so large that failure was inevitable. You got your hopes up so big you were going to feel disappointment. No human being, no child, or very few of them, are able to do what you expected me to do, right? You have to let a kid be who the kid is. And if that turns out to be a piano prodigy, that's great. But there's something else to her. You just have to find out what that is. But she would not do that. She was determined that she was going to find greatness in that child if she had to make it, because that's what America was, is you go to America and your kid becomes a genius. And I'm not going to be all those things, but my child is, and I'm going to live through my child those kinds of things that I didn't get. That's really bad news. And even worse, I never asked her what frightened me the most. Why had she given up hope? For after our struggle at the piano, she never mentioned my playing again. The lesson stopped, the lid to the piano was closed, shutting out the dust, my misery, and her dreams. Over. She just checked out at that point. When she turned 30, she said, "Do you want to come get the piano?" And she goes by and eventually picks up the piano. And inside the bench were the same exercise notes with handwritten scales, the same secondhand music books with their covers held together with yellow tape. This is all they could afford, right? She had never touched anything inside the piano in all those years. She left it and just left it alone, untouched, gathering dust, never moved a thing. It's like she never even went in near that piano again because of the pain of what was caused by that. She finds 2 compositions, Pleading Child and Perfectly Contented. Ironic, eh? The titles of those. And then she finds out, after she looks at it carefully, she says, you know what? These aren't two separate pieces. They're the same piece. They're just two parts of it. Pleading child, perfectly contented. Right? Think about those titles and the profundity of that. Pleading child was shorter but slower. Perfectly contented was longer but faster. Interesting, eh? Think about that for a moment. And after I played them both a few times, I realized they were two halves of the same thing. The musical score, the compositions, the pieces there, and the piano itself becomes very, very symbolic of what? Of this investment in a dream that wasn't destined to be, and it's too painful to haul the piano out. It's too painful to look at it. It's too painful even to dust it off. I don't want to think about that, because it's a hope and it's a dream I had for my child, and it's gone, but it was never perhaps the right hope or the right dream, right? Anyway, fantastic piece, really, really interesting piece, and one by a writer that I encourage you to read more of, because she is so talented. She's such a gifted individual when it comes to words. I don't know what Amy Tan's mother would think of her fantastically successful writing career, because she is one of the most famous writers in America today. Not a piano virtuoso, that's for sure, right? May or may not know the capital of Finland, but she became a great writer despite all that. Anyway, let's do a quiz, right? Let's do our little quiz here. Quiz question number 1. What's the substance Hazel Morse takes to commit suicide? Question 2. Why doesn't the narrator's father like his sister in Kingston's On Discovery? And number 3. What are pleading child and perfectly contented? You ought to know that if you listen to this video, right? Okay, so need those turned in by Tuesday at midnight. There'll also be a discussion section on Canvas for this course. Remember that this is following our bye week, if you will. If you look at our semester like sports, we had a bye week where I'm in class giving out papers and tests that have been graded, and this is the Tuesday following that. So make sure that that's when it's due, the Tuesday following that. So make sure you get all that turned in time, okay? We'll see you soon.